Heather Brasell. I live in South Georgia, and I'm a private landowner, and you can tell I'm a working landowner because the only part of uniform I wear is my boots. They're hardly ever off my feet. So when I am going to a lot of sessions, it's really interesting to hear from people who are actually growing timber, not just loving the habitat. So I have multiple objectives. I love my habitat. I do a lot for my wildlife habitat, both the uplands, the well drain, as well as the wetlands, and I try to use fire in all of them. But I also need to grow timber. My land needs to look after itself. No freeloaders. I've got to get some income from it. And that changes how I see fire on my property. So there's a lot of negative consequences when you're burning. You can kill trees, and I have. Even if I don't kill them, I can scorch them so badly that I lose timber growth. I lose volume. And when I went through a forestry program, one of the things they said is that if you scorch the bottom third of your pine trees, you're probably not impacting your growth, because those lower needles are not photosynthetically active. And so it doesn't, your needles, your canopy, that's the engine that drives the growth of your timber. But if you start scorching higher up, then you're starting to lose some growth. And of course, it's costing me time and money and fuel and everything else. So why do I do it? Well, there are some positive consequences as well that we often don't think about, these positive and negative consequences economically. If you're lucky, you can get some cost share for burning. I typically get cost share only about 1 year out of 3, but apparently this year there's a lot more funding and they're expecting a lot more. Last year, hardly anybody got funded. This year, they're expecting a lot more funding available. But there are indirect positive impacts as well. If you look at those two, whenever I get discouraged about how much work it takes, I drive down the road and my land is on the right, and it used to look like the property on the left, and that's my kinfolks. And they don't thin and burn, and I do. Which would you rather have? Now, think about if you're a deer or a turkey. Which one is going to provide your needs better? My property, right? Which means that when I get hunters in, not only can they actually see the deer to shoot them, but they get a much better aesthetic experience as well. That means that I can charge more in hunting leases. So there's an indirect benefit there. I also, in managing my timber, I need to, when I do a thin, I need to mark those trees. Well, if you're in there marking trees, which stand would you rather be marking? Okay, which one is it they're going to charge me more for marking my timber? Obviously, they love going into my property, and I often will coordinate with them, and I put a burn through there before they come into market. If you're trying to do a final harvest and you're doing it and you need to get an inventory so that they can estimate for a lump sum bid and things like that. If you're in there doing a cruise, you know that if you're going to be going through the property on the left, you know that you're not going to walk through all that. You're going to do an eyeball from a distance. Are you going to do an accurate inventory, or are you going to do a lowball one just because you may not have got it right? So you're actually going to get better lump sum bids if you have a clean understory and the people can actually get in there and see what trees you got. You're also more likely to get poles and higher prices for poles. They're not going to go into that junk on the left and look for poles. So there are economic incentives there from having been actively burning your property. In site preparation, I burn before I do my final harvest. And when I go in there to do the site preparation, that site is already clean. I don't have to do any site prep. So I'm saving on site preparation costs as well. And these are the things that we often don't talk about and think about in terms of offsetting the costs of burning. One of the other things I do is that I spend a lot of time with invasive plants. Unfortunately, I have plenty, and I'm sure I'm not alone. My very first experience with a growing season burn was in fact something that looked like this. When I'm managing invasive plants, I'm using integrated plant pest management strategies. That means cultural, biological, burning, mechanical, and chemical. What have I missed? Did I get those right? Anyway, 5 different strategies you can use to control your invasive species, and you're using a combination of them. It's a toolkit, depending on what you've got and what you need to what you're trying to accomplish. And you know that the cost of burning is less than the cost of mowing, which is less than the cost of using herbicide. So which am I going to want to fork out for? If I can, I want to get it done with burning. So the first site that I did is like this: blackberry growing up with grapes over the top of it, no fuel on the ground, will not carry fire. So, but poking out of it was this Japanese climbing fern, hiding away. And I know that Japanese climbing fern, you need to spray every leaf of it to have a hope in hell of killing it. And so what I did is I went in there and I ran a very hot fire through at the end of August, my first growing season burn. I was scared stiff. And then what happens is that when it regrows, the grapes are on the ground. Over here is the climbing fern. Over here is the grapes. I can come in and I can spray small spots instead of having to broadcast and kill everything, including my desirable species. So that using the fire to reduce all camouflage for the climbing fern, expose the climbing fern so I could then treat it. And you can do the same kind of combination, which I've done with mow as well. I also love native plants, and I manage for them. And so with somebody, I think it was Tony, talked about the importance of growing season burns to increase the viability of your wiregrass seed. I've been on field trips where some plants need to be burned in October in order to produce viable seeds. I don't remember what that species is. I wish I could. But another one is my pitcher plants you can see here. They're hiding away in the wetlands, so they're covered up with gallberry and tie-tie. And I need to get a fire through there to expose them. When I first found these populations, there are a few spindly, shriveled up old leaves on the pitcher plants. I ran a fire through them. The next season, they were just lush, big clumps of pitcher plants that were thriving. And so you're doing a lot for different species by running a fire through at different times. So in terms of forest management, when I'm thinning, I'm often managing my forests so that I can get fire through them. And that means that when I'm thinning, I had a forest consultant came along, and I had stands like this with a lot of woody understory, and he thins heavily going straight to the crop trees. And that meant I was down to 50, 60 basal area. And when I burned it the first time after thinning, it burned beautifully. But after that, there weren't enough trees to produce needles on the ground. There was no grasses or herbaceous understory. It was hard as the dickens to get a fire to carry through that stand. So now I have standing instructions for him that if we have a stand like this that needs thinning, I want you to thin just a little bit and leave those pine trees to produce pine needles on the ground to help me keep getting that second fire in there. And then if I keep doing that, I'm going to get the grasses and the herbaceous understory that will then carry the fire. So when I do a second thinning, you can take as many as you want and just leave my crop trees. And so I'm managing my thinning operation so that I can carry fire. Longleaf, Shan, I think, was talking about you can burn the young trees. This is on the left. That's exactly the same plant. And you can see it looks shriveled up. What was the term you used? Caramelized? Fricassee?
Fricassee.
Okay, anyway, the one on the left looks awful, doesn't it? But if you peel back those needles, you can see it's still green in there. Those needles are protecting the apical bark. And Shan said, don't burn them till the second year. Well, I don't listen to that. I took a stand out of pine straw raking, and it happened to be a really bumpy year. In fact, it was this last year for seeding from the longleaf overstory. And it was just a carpet of babies on the ground. And I ran a fire through there. Well, this is it. The third one there is 1 month after burning, and you can see there are a lot of young ones. They're babies. They've only just germinated. And the one on the right is 2 months after burning, and you can see I hardly killed a single one. And they're way more than I need anyway. So if I kill a few, I'm not going to be too worried. So I don't wait. The rule of thumb they say is wait till it's a 1-inch crown, the stem. But I've found almost no mortality, even if I do it younger than that. And as I say, they have to thin out at some point anyway. So because of that, when I'm doing site preparation, I'm planning ahead for being able to carry fire. When I first took over management of the property, they used the typical arsenal glyphosate kind of mix to nuke the site. And what I found is that it depends what I'm going to plant there. If I'm going to plant loblolly, I know that it's fire sensitive, and I'm not going to be able to bring in fire until those trees are up. Typically what I do, purely because of laziness or convenience, whatever, is that I wait till I thin and all the fuels are on the ground and I can burn and not scorch the trees. And that's about the right time, about 13, 15 years old. And so I'll burn it then. But if I know I can't burn for at least 10 years, I want to control that woody understory before I plant. Otherwise, it's going to be out competing my loblollies. But if I'm planting longleaf, and I know that longleaf handles fire, I just showed you so, right? Then what I do is I use herbicides that don't kill the grasses. That means that I finish up with a stand on the right. Would you believe that's exactly what it looked like when I planted the trees? And this is actually 1 year afterwards. And yes, it's horrible broom sedge, but it will carry fire, won't it? And in the meantime, the other species start seeding in or coming up from the seed bank. And I do banded spray over the top of my longleaf, but I can carry fire. I can get the fire in there and hammer those loblolly weeds that are seeding into my longleaf stand, and I can control them before they start out competing my longleaf. So when I'm doing thinning and site preparation, I'm planning ahead for how to maintain fire continuity. So some of the things that I think about when I'm doing dormant versus growing season burns. I was talking to a guy yesterday down at the loading ramp at George Smith, and I said, what a wonderful fire those guys did yesterday. And he said, oh, it's too late. I said, why? He said, well, everything's too green and too wet. And I said, well, it burned, didn't it? And so what I find is that if I'm burning in the dormant season, my worst fires are desiccated grasses. They spot they spot dreadfully. And if you've got any kind of a wind, they're very flashy. They jump and they burn and so on. Jonathan, don't you remember that one? I hated it. That was the worst one ever. But if you're doing it in the growing season, they've got a lot of moisture. They're green. They've got a lot of moisture. That moisture absorbs a lot of the heat energy and it dampens the intensity of the fire. And so you get a less flashy, more even kind of behavior. And that takes a lot of pressure off me in terms of anxiety. In dormant season, the relative humidity is a lot lower, particularly early in the morning. You can get started earlier. If it's growing season, your humidity's higher, and that means that you often can't get the burn started well until about lunchtime, which puts you up against the end of the day to get finished. And if you've got thunderstorms or anything like that, you've got a narrow window to get it done. And also because of the more humidity, you're likely to have more smoke issues there as well. So in the dormant season, I do a lot of backfire. And I tend to have fire breaks because it's just me and my guy. And we have fire breaks that are about 4 chains apart. Why 4 chains? Because a backfire, rule of thumb, travels about 1 chain an hour. And if we are lit up by noon, he can go home at 4 o'clock and I can look after the rest of the fire. So we can light up multiple lines of fire. Whereas in the growing season, you need to get that heat in there. And I'm much more likely to do head fires. When I first started out, I'd always do the black line first, and I still do. But I go in much sooner now to do head fires because I know that's what's going to be needed with those green, lush, shrubby things that I'm trying to kill. So in terms of weather, in the dormant season, I'm most concerned about those low humidities. And I wouldn't be burning anything less than about a 25 relative humidity, 25%. I've had way too much problem with spotting, particularly if there are grasses. And of course, if there's high wind speed. I've had a grass fire that's traveling faster than I can on an ATV. And I'm no sluggish driver, am I? So the weather concerns in the growing season is the high temperature, both for people and for plants. And I'll go back to that in a minute. But the other one is atmospheric stability. You're much more likely to have downdrafts and updrafts. And I've been caught on the corner of a stand that was my most vulnerable part of the stand with gallberry this high. And I had a beautiful little fire going along. And suddenly I got a downdraft and that flame was 30 feet high in the corner of my stand. Watch your atmospheric stability. And I've learned to read my weather forecasts a lot better after that experience. So when you're burning, the lethal temperature for your needles is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 minutes. So if you're burning in winter and the temperature is 50 degrees, you've got a long way to go to get to that 150. But if you're burning in the middle of summer, when the temperature is 90 degrees out there, you're much closer to that lethal temperature in the crown. So what happens is that if you've got severe scorch, and Shan, you did a wonderful job of getting to that one. If you're burning in February, you're going to get new growth almost immediately. So it doesn't set the trees back very much at all. But if you're burning in the growing season, you've got months where they don't have, they're without their needles until they produce new needles. And so in this photo here, if I get severe scorch in my hardwoods, I say, yahoo, I'm killing that critter. But if it's scorching my crop trees, then I'm going to be suffering growth. They're more liable to stress and damage from insects and anything, drought, anything else. So the bottom line is that the more you burn, the easier it gets. And Chan did a great job of talking about reintroducing fire after a long period without. And I've had problems with that, I could tell you too. But you need to have pyrodiversity if you have multiple objectives. You're not accomplishing everything you want as a landowner and timber manager, forest manager, unless if you're restricting it only to that post deer season, 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, any questions? Berrien County in South Georgia.
What base layer is that?
I typically don't go by basal area as much as simply looking at it. When I'm thinning, I look at the diameter, I look at the height, which tells me about the site quality. I look at the diameter as evidence of past growth, and I look at the canopy as evidence of future growth. And that determines what I mark for removal. Also, of course, deformities. But I go light on it. And so to get to your real answer, probably I'd be aiming for 70, 80 rather than 50, 60 basal area. But that's not my metric. Yes.
What is the Gaskins education center?
Oh, as part of my property, I really am committed to environmental education and have developed part of my property as Gaskins Forest Education Center as a resource for places. And we've done learn and burns, we've done invasive species first detector. I've done programs for little kids, nature walks, community days. We need to have people that we share our resources with other people to develop a sense of ownership and understanding of what we're trying to protect, which is our natural environments. So I do whatever I can to support folks out there who are doing the programs.